All right, hello. If I could please get everybody's attention. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Welcome to the Anchorage Museum and welcome to this Cook Inlet Historical and Alaska Historical Society joint lecture. We are proud to support this ongoing lecture series as the society was integral in founding the museum all those years ago. As we take in the rich history of the lecture topics ahead, I would like to take a moment to recognize that this event takes place within a museum dedicated to preserving and illuminating the history of Alaska, and it sits on the ancestral homeland of the Eklutna Dena'ina people. The museum is committed to celebrating the culture and language of the Dena'ina. One last thing I would like to say is, in conjunction with the opening of our exhibition, Cold War to the Cosmos, Distant Early Warning Systems of the Arctic, the Anchorage Museum will be hosting a symposium on April 5th examining the Cold War's impact on Alaska and its people, featuring insights from award-winning authors Charles Woolforth, Indigenous History Professor Holly Guise, and Anchorage Museum's Director Julie Decker, and Anchorage Daily News writer Zachariah Hughes. This event includes presentations, a moderated panel discussion, and a guided visit to the exhibition Cold War to the Cosmos. This exhibition will open on April 4th, and there is a stanchion in the back of the auditorium with a QR code with a link to register for this symposium and more information. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to ask me. Now, to open up the program, we have President of the Alaska Historical Society, David Ramser.
Thanks, Danny, and the Anchorage Museum for once again hosting one of our joint events. Tonight we're in for a real treat. I've been privileged to hear our guest several times, and he's one of the most insightful, knowledgeable, and compelling speakers I've heard. No pressure, Professor. 2 years ago, the Alaska Historical Society launched its Critical Issues lecture series designed to raise the level of civil discourse and show how history can inform discussions of current issues. Of late, that seems more important than ever. Throughout the series, we've been honored to have the financial support of the Atwood Foundation and the partnership of many groups, including the Cook Inlet Historical Society, OLE, the Anchorage Museum, and for this event, the Alaska World Affairs Council, and the Aloft and Spring Hill Suites hotels in Anchorage and Fairbanks. And thanks to all of our partners. A couple years ago, I first saw Professor Brands in person at a writers' festival in Rancho Mirage, California. And I was so taken by his presentation that I went up afterwards and asked him if he'd ever consider coming to Alaska. He said, yeah, send me an email and I'll give it some thought. And I figured it was a polite way to blow me off. But a couple days later, he responded and said, I'd love to come, never been to Alaska, tell me when to be there. While carrying a full teaching load at the University of Texas, Austin, chairing the history department, he has produced more than 30 books, including 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning finalists. His work covers the breadth of American history, from Ben Franklin and the colonial period, to Andrew Jackson and Western expansion, to Ulysses Grant and the Civil War, and much more. His most recent book recounts the fierce debate over the U.S. entering World War II through the 2 most important figures of the era, FDR and Charles Lindbergh. And it holds many lessons for today's debate over American First policies. He'll be speaking on that topic tomorrow up in Fairbanks after what we hope is an uneventful sled dog experience. He also writes a near daily historical commentary on Substack called A User's Guide to History, which I highly recommend. Already today, Professor Brands has given 3 different presentations to local high school and UAA students and to members of 49 writers. As America gears up to mark 250 years of existence, Professor Brands is going to challenge us to envision the next 250. So please join me in welcoming Professor H.W. Brands to Alaska.
Thank you, David, for that very kind introduction. Thank you all for having me here. I'm delighted to be here and to have the opportunity to visit your great state. I live in Texas. I'm not from Texas, so I don't feel the proprietary sense the Texans often do of their state. Some of you are old enough to remember when Texas lost its pride of place as the largest state in the Union. And I imagine it became a point of pride for Alaskans, but there are Texans who still bear the psychic scars of no longer being the biggest. You know, there is a saying that still is common in Texas, that everything's bigger in Texas. So I need to ask, is there something comparable in Alaska? Is everything bigger than bigger in Alaska?
I would just say that if you cut Alaska in half, then Texas would be the 3rd largest.
I will take that home to my Texas Patriot friends and see what they say to that. Anyway, it's a delight to be here and to try to take on this challenging topic of America's next 250 years. Now, I will confess at the beginning, this is kind of a bait and switch business. I don't know what the country's going to look like 250 years from now. But I have figured out, I'm not the only one to figure this out, that it's a very hazardous business to predict what's going to happen tomorrow. It's easy as pie to predict what's going to happen in 250 years. Needless to say, nobody's going to be around to prove me wrong. But you might very well ask, what in the world does a historian have to say about the future? I usually refuse to answer questions on the present because I don't know how it turned out. I mean, this is what historians do. We look at what happened in the past. We wait until it's far enough in the past so we know what it adds up to, what it meant. Now, I was asked actually this very topic earlier today. So how do you know? How do you know when you're far enough away to know how it turns out? And I had to admit that that is always a work in progress. And so something can happen, and you think, that's it. We know how it turned out. The example I gave this afternoon was, in 1995, it was very possible, it was very tempting to say, we know how the Cold War turned out. Our side won, the other side lost. The Soviet Union dissolved, and the issues that gave rise to the Cold War are no longer with us. The Cold War is done, and I actually worked on that premise to write a book about the Cold War, looking at the Cold War from start to finish. And it was one of the first books that came out taking the position that the Cold War is done, so we can see the whole thing, and we know what it meant. Well, time moves on. Russia revives its old imperial ideas. Turns out that the Russia of today is not that different from the Soviet Union of the Commissars. And it turns out that the breakup of the Soviet Union, well, maybe wasn't so permanent as we thought. So, anyhow, I am going to take a stab at what America might experience during the next 250 years. I'm not going to say, okay, we're going to jump down 250 years from now, and this is what it's going to look like. And the way I'm going to do it is the way historians do deal with the present and imagining at least the near future by examining the past. How did we get to where we are? What got us here? To what extent are the things that got us here, the influences, the forces, to what extent are they still at work? Have they changed over time? Will they continue to change over time? And I'm going to premise this by saying there are certain things I'm going to leave out of the discussion entirely. Things that are, we'll say, sort of exogenous to the United States. So, for example, if the warming that the planet has experienced over the last 50 years runs crazy over the next 50 years, all bets are off. We don't know what the world is going to look like. That's one possibility. I'm not going to deal with that because that just, who knows? I'm also not going to deal with, that is one really potentially important influence, but I've got nothing particular to say about it that other people haven't said. I am going to suggest another wild card that could really dramatically change the way not only the United States develops, but the way the world develops. You're probably aware that something really profound has happened in several countries, probably many countries around the world in the last 20 years. And that is populations, national populations, that had been growing from 10,000 years ago, from the agricultural revolution of the Neolithic age until the year 2000. Populations had been growing. Sometimes they would grow faster, sometimes they would grow slower. Sometimes there would be a reverse when there was a great epidemic, like the Black Death of the 14th century, where the population of Europe plummeted. But it quickly resumed its rise. And so the growth of the human population, from your perspective, here's the graph, it doesn't grow much for a long period of time. Then you hit the agricultural revolution, it starts to rise. Then you hit the industrial revolution, it takes off. And so, I look out, and some of you are old enough to remember, during the 1970s and 1980s, and in some places even later than that, the grave concern was that the human population was going to outstrip the carrying capacity of the Earth. And there was a book called The Population Bomb. It was going to blow up the world. Now, it seemed reasonable, extrapolating from the events of the 50 years before that was going to happen. But in fact, in some cases of the richest countries in the world, populations are beginning to decline. And this is something that takes historians, demographers, takes everybody by surprise. Nobody saw this one coming 30 years ago. And it will change almost everything about human existence if it spreads to other countries. If we live in a world where the human population is going down instead of up, we've built all sorts of our assumptions about the future on the growth in populations. But if growth is negative, if the populations go down, the very first thing it's going to do is change the kind of services we can provide to people who live in our communities. So the American welfare state, to use that term, has been based on the idea that each generation is going to be bigger than the generation before. So there will always be more people earning money, putting money into the system, than taking money out of the system. But if that's not the case, and in Japan it's not the case, in South Korea it's not the case, in Italy it's not the case, in lots of countries it's not the case. So it puts strain on those expectations of what the community can provide to the individuals, what the government can provide to citizens. But there is something else that is really, really striking about this. So in countries where the population's begun to tip down, governments have really tried to get people to have more kids. And this experiment has never been done. And nobody knows if it's possible. So why do people choose not to have kids? You know, to get into the details of this, before reliable contraception, having children was a side effect of having sex. And most people like having sex, and if you had sex often enough, you'd have kids. And so people usually didn't make a choice, shall we have more kids or not? You just had sex and you had kids. But once you could split the decision to have kids from the decision to have sex, then humans could decide, do we want 0 kids, 1 kid, 2 kids, how many kids? And humanity has never had this option in the past. And we don't know what humanity is going to do with this. And I'm looking around at the aged people. I grew up in a family of 4 children. This was in the 1950s. We're all born in the 1950s. And this is pretty common. But my kids grew up in a family of a couple of kids. And everybody they knew, a couple of kids. So is there any incentive for people who grow up with, say, 1 or 2 siblings to have 5 siblings? I don't know if there is. I don't know if it would occur to anybody to have more. If you were the only child in your family, would you think I would have been better off with more siblings? If you're the only kid in your family, would you think, I'm going to have 3 kids? I mean, you could have 2 kids. Because, of course, if every family has just 1 kid, then, roughly speaking, the population halves each generation. I mean, there have been some extrapolations that the population of China is, I think it was just recently surpassed by India as the most populous nation in the world. But if the trends of the last 30 years in China continue, the population of China will decrease by several hundred million people. Over the next 20 or 30 years, China will be a small country. Anyway, I'm leaving this out of the discussion. Because I don't know. I don't know what's this going to happen. But if it does, will the United States be a great power? Would the United States be a great power if it had half the population it has now? If it has half the population it has now, presumably the economy will be smaller. Maybe we'll get more productive in certain areas. But the power that a country can convey to the world, can project to the world, depends, in very large part, on the size of that country's economy. The United States has been the most powerful country in the world because since the beginning of the 20th century, the United States has had the largest, most productive economy in the world. Over my years studying history, I have developed what I modestly call Branz's laws of history. And I call them Branz's laws, not because I'm inordinately proud of them and I want the world to know they're mine. It's really, I want the world to know they're mine so they don't blame other historians for these. I'm the only one who believes in Branz's laws of history. But one of them, and I think they're all pretty true, and to the extent that they're the way they're explained. But this one is, I haven't seen any counterexamples. And this one says, sooner or later, every country gets the foreign policy it can afford. And the implication here is that rich countries have ambitious foreign policies. Poor countries, they don't change the world, they get along with the world that they exist in. So now I am actually getting to this question of what is America going to look like in the next 250 years? Because looking back for the first 250 years, the United States had a very modest foreign policy. For the first 120, 30 or 40 or 50 years of its national existence. So if we start in 1776, because we're coming up on 2026, that's 250. In 1776, the United States had a very modest foreign policy. The United States was a small country. It was on the edge of Western civilization, clinging to the eastern seaboard of North America. The population of the United States in 1776 was about 2.5 million people. A small country, not the size of a decent-sized city in the United States, a city in the United States city. That was the population of the whole United States. And being small, being distant, being relatively poor, Americans did not imagine that they could or should change the world. They accepted the world as it existed and they made the best of it. And for the most part, that meant staying out of other countries' affairs. And this was the rule. This was almost an aspect of America's civic religion. We do not mess in other people's affairs. We do not fight other people's wars. And this was true from George Washington, the first president, who warned Americans against getting overly involved in the affairs of Europe. There was a war going on almost constantly between Britain and France during Washington's presidency. He says, we're not going to get involved. He proclaimed neutrality for the United States. And when he left the White House, when he was about to leave in 1796, he said, I leave this as my message to you. Stay out of the affairs of foreign countries. And Americans said, well, if George Washington told us to stay out, we'll stay out. And it seemed to comport with Americans' views of what their country ought to do, what their own sense of American self-interest dictated. Europe was far away. Asia was even farther. Europe is constantly at war. There's nothing for us to gain by getting involved in the wars of Europe. So it was partly George Washington's advice that led to this policy. It was also the fact that America was a comparatively poor country. One way of looking at foreign policy, especially an ambitious foreign policy, is that it is a form of insurance. It is designed to protect against accidents of international life. You buy fire insurance, you buy home insurance, you buy auto insurance to protect against bad things that might happen. You could call it foreign policy insurance. So, for example, during the 1960s, as some of the audience will remember, the United States fought a war in Southeast Asia. Why should the United States fight a war in Southeast Asia? If you remember the reasoning, it was that if South Vietnam falls to the communists, then Laos and Cambodia will fall to the communists, and then Thailand and the Philippines. The dominoes will fall. And eventually, the United States will be surrounded by communist countries. So eventually, after all the dominoes have fallen, they'll be coming after us. Now, this was a stretch, and it was going to take a long time. And if the United States had not been a rich country, Americans would have said, well, okay, that's something that might happen in the distant future, but we can't do anything about it, so forget about it. We won't try. But the United States was a rich country in the 1960s. You notice I used the was, rich. We'll argue about whether the United States is as rich today as it was then. In absolute terms, of course, yes. But in a lot of things that matter in the world, it's not the absolute value of what you have, it's the comparative value. The United States, comparatively speaking, is less rich today than it was in the 1960s. Because countries that are now nearly America's equal, economically, China, the European Union, they were much weaker, much smaller then than now. The United States could dictate to the world in the 1940s and in the 1950s, into the 1960s, largely. These are the rules of the road in international affairs. We've got the money to underwrite, for example, the international monetary system, the so-called Bretton Woods system, where the currencies, the major currencies of the world, were fixed, had fixed exchange rates to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. And so the dollar became the world's basic currency. It was the currency of the world. The dollar today remains the world's favorite reserve currency, but will it always? This is the question if we're talking about the future. I'm going to pick up some other things, but just bear this in mind. Because America's ability to change the world, I would argue, is much less today than it was in the 1940s. In the 1940s, the United States, not by itself, but largely, defeated fascism, defeated Nazi Germany, defeated Japan, defeated Italy, and established the system of international affairs that has persisted since then. Now, we live at a time when that system of international affairs is under question, under challenge, under attack. Will it survive another 5 years? I don't know. Will it survive another 50 years? I doubt it. So things do change, in large part because the United States no longer can overawe the rest of the world economically. Okay, bear that in mind. That is one change that is likely to come. And it's going to come because Americans ask a lot more of government today than Americans did 50 years ago. Certainly than Americans did 100 years ago, than Americans did 150 years ago. In the 1880s, Grover Cleveland was president of the United States. Texas farmers were suffering from an extended drought. And Congress passed a bill that was going to provide relief to Texas farmers. Federal money was going to help these suffering Texas farmers out. And the Texas delegation got together and did favors for other delegations and got Congress to pass this Texas Farm Relief Bill. And Grover Cleveland vetoed the bill. And he said that it has always been my understanding that that the people should support the government and not the government support the people. People were expected to look out for themselves. This attitude changed over time. By the 1930s, when the New Deal was created, the attitude had flipped for very good reason. That during the Depression, a lot of people lost their jobs, lost their homes, lost their bank accounts, their savings, their livelihoods, their futures. And here's the key, through no fault of their own. They had done everything right. They had worked hard. They showed up at work every day. They'd pay their mortgages. They'd pay their premiums. They hadn't splurged during the go-go 1920s. And then their banks collapsed. And if you were at the verge of retirement, you'd been saving up your whole life, doing absolutely everything right, and your bank went bankrupt on you, your life savings is gone, and you face old age of poverty. And you would say, wait a minute, what did I do to deserve this? And a lot of people are in the same boat, and they said, we didn't do anything to deserve this. What we need here is for government to support us. Grover Cleveland had said, no, government doesn't support the people, but 50 years later, the people said, yeah, it should. And so began the development of what political scientists call the welfare state. A system where citizens rely on government for support in various ways. It began with Social Security. It extended to Medicare, Social Security in the 1930s, Medicare, Medicaid in the 1960s. It extended to federal money for education, for student loans. The GI Bill, the federal government got in the business of lending money to people who were buying houses. There were a variety of reasons for all of this, but the end result was that people got in the habit of thinking that the government was going to support them. Nowadays, for example, once you reach 65, or if you retire at 70, or you don't start collecting Social Security, well, you might as well start at 70 because it doesn't get any higher after that. You know, you put the money in, you say, I earned this, and you're going to take it out. When my great-grandfather, it never would have occurred to him to think that government was going to help pay a pension. Likewise, in the old days before the 1960s, you got sick, you went to the doctor, you paid for it out of pocket. The idea that the government should help this, I mean, of course, you're taxed for this, but nonetheless, the government is there. And so, Americans have gotten used to the idea that government is going to be there. This is a decision that we have made democratically. You know, we voters, maybe you didn't vote for it, but a majority of people did, voted for the people who did vote for it. And most Americans like this idea. I mean, even somebody who's as determined to, at least he says, he's determined to cut the federal deficit, cut federal spending, as Donald Trump says, I'm not touching Social Security, I'm not touching Medicare. These are policies that were extremely controversial when they were introduced, but they have become just an expectation that everybody has of life. Conservatives were opposed to them then. Conservatives are just as happy as anybody else to cash those Social Security checks and to get Medicare when they reach 65. So, much more is asked of the US government than was asked 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And what this means is that the government's ability to do stuff other than provide welfare support, welfare state kind of support to the citizens, is dramatically reduced. In the 1940s, when the United States created the modern post-war system, there weren't these demands on the government, and the government could easily spend 6%, 8%, 10% on defense, on national security. Nowadays, it's a strain to get the US government to spend 4%. Okay? And going forward, there will come a time, it's already coming in certain areas, but there definitely will come a time when Americans will have to choose between Social Security and an ambitious definition of American foreign policy. The term that originated during the 1960s was guns and butter. Guns is national defense. Guns is fighting the war in Vietnam. Butter is a welfare entitlement programs at home. In the 1960s, the Great Society, the war on poverty. In the 1960s, the United States could have guns and butter both. By the 1970s, there was some strain, but still, Americans could have it all. And I call this sometimes a period from the 1940s to about 2000, or a little after, maybe till 9/11, 2001. The era of America's free security. Free in the following sense, not that paying for the wars in Korea and Vietnam and the Persian Gulf didn't cost money, but that there never was a decision on foreign policy that was made either for or against because of the cost of doing it. There was never a time when a president had to say, you know, I'd really like to invade that country. I'd really like to go to the aid of that country over there, but we can't afford to do it. The operating assumption was that if we want to do it, if it's important to do it, we will do it. And we will still increase the size and comprehensiveness of the welfare state. But in this century, in the 21st century, increasingly these questions are being asked. Increasingly, people look at the mounting size of the federal debt and say, this cannot continue to rise at this rate forever and ever. Something's got to give. And I ask you, what's going to give first? Will it be that ambitious foreign policy, or Americans say, okay, you know, we're going to defend Taiwan. It might cost hundreds of billions of dollars. We've already spent several $100 billion defending Ukraine, and so we can do it. But wait a minute. If doing that means not doing something else, well, maybe we won't do that. Maybe a Taiwan independent of China is not really worth that much. Is it? Is it an essential element of American happiness and prosperity, as important as, say, your Social Security check? I will give you an idea of the mechanism, how this works. Some of you will remember, until probably 8 or 10 years ago, the Social Security Administration would send out every year, you remember when you got your statement of account from Social Security? And it would say that since you made your first paycheck, and we, the Social Security Administration, took out our first part of it, you have contributed X number of dollars toward your savings account. And if you continue to contribute at this rate until you retire when you are age 65 or 70, whatever it is, then you will receive a monthly paycheck of this much. Remember getting those? You can still actually go to the Social Security website and check this out. If you haven't retired yet, you see, okay, if I work until 67, I get this much. If I work until 70, I get this much, and so on. And when you got this statement of account, or nowadays when you go on the website, it has your name, it has your Social Security number. It has this, what looks like a bank balance. You contributed this much, and here's your projected returns. Okay, it looks like there is money waiting for you. And when it looks this way, people, not unusually, think that it's theirs. After all, I've been contributing all this money, and it was put into a bank account, it's been earning interest, and I'm going to get more back. They think you have, I have, we all have, an ownership stake in this. Now, this is in fact a fiction. There is no safe deposit box in Washington with your name on it, and this cash that's been building up. But it's a very useful fiction for those people who like the idea of Social Security. Franklin Roosevelt, who was the president responsible for this, knew exactly what he was doing. He said, it was pointed out to him, this gives a misleading impression of what's happening with this Social Security system. People think that this is a savings account, and they have a moral claim on this amount that's being taken out. And he said, I know that's not true. The money is coming in through this window and going out the next day out this other window. It's a pay-as-you-go system, but you set it up this way. And where Roosevelt said this was a potential critic of the Social Security system, he says, you set it up this way, and the words he used were, no damn politician is ever going to be able to take this away from the American people. And he was exactly right. You cannot touch Social Security. At least it hasn't been done yet. But what this means is that when that moment arrives, and we're very close to it, we've already probably been there a little bit, when the moment arrives when Americans have to choose between Social Security and more spending on defense, then all the odds are going to favor Social Security, because when every year the Social Security Administration was sending me what looked like this statement of account with my balance in it, the Pentagon was not sending me anything like it. I do not have a defense account in Washington. And so I don't feel as though I have any moral claim on a certain level of spending for defense. And if you think about it, most people occasionally think about foreign policy. People think every day about how much money they have in the bank, whether they'll be able to pay their bills, whether they're going to be able to buy this, buy that. So when push comes to shove, I will make the prediction, and I'm pretty confident in this prediction, that Americans will choose Social Security over that new or even existing foreign policy commitment. Because that's getting expensive, and its returns are pretty nebulous. Is that really going to make American life better? Whereas, if you take away my Social Security, my life is going to be made worse. Okay, so this is one prediction that I'm going to make. That American foreign policy, maybe starting in this presidency, Donald Trump has already said that he's essentially pulling the plug on aid to Ukraine. This was a project of the Biden administration, and President Trump ran for president again in 2024, clearly indicating that if he was elected, things are going to change. And he was elected. And so it would be surprising if he did make this change. And of course, he's talking to Vladimir Putin, and they're apparently trying to negotiate an end to this. So this could be the beginning of the end of what I call this era of free security in American life, an American approach to the world. It's going to happen. Is it going to happen this year, next year? I don't know. But it'll certainly happen within the next few decades. Because the trends that put it in motion, they're not going to change. Various people who study national security affairs say the United States ought to double what it spends on defense. It's going to have to if it's going to continue to honor the commitments that it's made. But politically, there is no groundswell of support for doubling the American defense budget. And when people realize, well, it means we're not going to get these other things that we've gotten used to and we like, it's simply not going to happen. So, that's one prediction. I'm almost going to say you can take that one to the bank, but we're still talking about the future. I want to talk a little bit about sort of the structure of American life today, in the past, and then going forward. And here I am going to make use of nearly the whole 250 years that I've got to work with, the 250 years in the past, to project 250 years into the future. And the way I characterize the structure of American life is as follows. We have organized our economy in a particular way. It's based on private property and on market exchanges. And the label for this system is capitalism. We have based our economic life on capitalism. It's not 100% capitalism. I put a question to my students in Texas. I teach at the University of Texas. It is like the University of Alaska, a public university. And I put the question to them this way. I say, okay, all of you decided to come to the University of Texas, right? You had various reasons for coming to the University of Texas. I want you to ask why you chose the University of Texas. You could have chosen other universities. And in fact, in Texas, there are a wide array of choices. Students could have gone to Rice University, a very well-respected private university in Houston. You could have gone to Southern Methodist University in Dallas. You could have gone to Texas Christian University. You'll notice that all of these are private universities. They chose a public university over these private universities. And the way I put it is, well, stuff that happens in the private sector, this happens in the capitalist realm of life. Capitalism is all about the private sector, private property, and decisions made not by government, but by individuals, one-to-one. So that is the private sector. The other sector is under the purview and on the nickel of government, and we call that the public sector. Now, in the United States today, the United States is largely a capitalist economy, but only largely, because between 35 and 40% of the American economy is actually in the public sector. So one way of putting this is that the United States is really only 2/3 capitalist and 1/3, what do you call it when the economy takes place in the public sector? What do you call it when there's government ownership of things? Socialism. So, the American economy is actually roughly 2/3 capitalist and 1/3 socialist. Now, I put this question to my Texas students. Texas is a conservative state. And my kids are mostly Texans. A lot of them come from conservative families. And I say, you had a choice. You had a choice for your college of going to college, being educated in the capitalist sector or in the socialist sector. Which sector did you choose by coming to the University of Texas? You chose the socialist sector. And some of them are taken aback by that. Wait a minute, socialism? That's not a good thing. And a lot of conservatives think that socialism is not a good thing. But most of them, at least in Texas, they kind of got used to the idea of the University of Texas. At least if it, was playing for the national championship or something like that in football. But anyway, I say this just by way of reminding that when I say the U.S. has a capitalist economy, it's by no means entirely capitalist, but it is more capitalist than the economy of just about any other country in the world. So European countries, they're more like 55% capitalist, 45% socialist, to use my terminology. Anyway, it was not always so. Capitalism did not exist in the United States in 1776. In fact, it hardly existed anywhere in 1776 except in the mind of one Scottish economist who wrote the Manifesto of Capitalism just months from the time that one Thomas Jefferson wrote the Manifesto of American Democracy. And that Scottish economist's name was Adam Smith. And he was arguing for this new system that didn't exist. This system based on private property, that based on personal interest, that based on markets, based on free trade, on all the stuff we associate with modern capitalism. It took a while to catch on in the United States. Capitalism first began to rear its head in the United States in the first half of the 19th century. But it really took hold in the second half of the 19th century. The period is called the Gilded Age. And the Gilded Age was characterized by the emergence of great corporations. They were called trusts in those days. And we still have antitrust legislation and antitrust prosecution. These were attempts to break up these big corporate monopolies. So capitalism took hold in the United States in the 19th century. So historians often look at how things change and when they change. And so when I talk about capitalism, I do a before and after comparison. In 1800, the United States was not yet capitalist. It was, some of the ideas were floating around, but it wasn't there yet. By 1900, 100 years later, the United States was the most capitalist country in the world, and it was more capitalist then than it ever would be later. So that socialist sector hadn't started to emerge yet. So from 1800 to 1900, the US embraced capitalism. Not everybody liked it. There were people who didn't like it. There are people who don't like it today. It brings inequality. It brings corporate power that didn't exist before. But Americans have consistently reconciled themselves to capitalism because what it does deliver, if you want to use sort of a pejorative thing, the grossest gross domestic product you could get. It magnifies total output. Capitalism per se doesn't care how it's distributed. And so if John D. Rockefeller makes 1,000 times what somebody working in one of his refineries makes, that's okay. Capitalism is agnostic on that subject. So if your goal is to increase the gross domestic product the most and most rapidly, capitalism is the system for you. And America embraced it in the 19th century, from 1800 to 1900. Hold that thought. America became a capitalist economy. Capitalism characterizes American relations in the economic world. What characterizes American relations in the political world? Democracy. If you could only have two words to describe America from 1900 until about now, you would say it is a capitalist democracy, or it has a democratic capitalist system. You could put one or the other first, but democracy characterizes the way we do things in politics, capitalist the way things we do in economics. And between those two, that covers a lot of ground of American life, or life in any nation. And again, the United States was not born democratic. And of course, we're talking small d democratic. The United States was not born a democracy. In 1776, the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, they thought that democracy was an insidious ideology that was one half step toward anarchy. If you let the people actually rule, how will they know what to do? How will they make good decisions? They're not trained, they're not experienced, they're not smart enough to do it. So what America created in 1776, again, the starting point for all this, was a republic. Now, what's a republic? A republic was usually defined negatively. It's not a monarchy. And it's a system based on the Latin words res publica, the things, the affairs of the people. It was one in which political power derived from the people, but often in a vague, nebulous way. But nobody in 1776 thought ordinary people should actually rule, should actually govern. Yes, Thomas Jefferson did say all men are created equal, but what he really meant was that Americans have and ought to have political rights equal to those of the British. And so that justifies Americans to create their own government. He wasn't saying that that guy behind his plow in Tidewater, Virginia, is the equal of me and should have the same political power. But that idea did develop. And just as it took decades for Adam Smith's ideas to catch on and take hold and change American life, so with the ideas of Thomas Jefferson, especially this idea that all men are created equal. Jefferson had this particular meaning for it, but once you say it, once those words get out there, once that idea goes abroad, and Americans read in their founding charter that all men are created equal, that means me. I'm a farmer in Tennessee. I'm a blacksmith in Kentucky. I ought to have equal political power, say with anybody else. And so by the time Andrew Jackson is elected president in 1828, this concept of democracy had taken hold. And it carried all before it. Because this idea of equality, it is, in the context of American life, after the Declaration of Independence, it's almost irrefutable. You cannot stand up and say, no, I don't believe in political equality. Oh, well, you could, actually, if you were John Calhoun, for example, the last apologist for slavery in the South. But once the Civil War is won by the North, then all the resistance to democracy goes away. Again, it's not perfect. Not everybody gets to vote. Women didn't get the vote until 1920. Here's a question for you. Are there any sizable groups in America today that still can't vote?
Yeah.
Who are they? Felons, that's one, but I got a bigger group for you.
Kids.
Kids, children. Now, some of you will remember, I remember, when 18-year-olds got the vote. You may remember the paradoxically ironic way in which this came about. So during the Vietnam War, people of my generation, and maybe some of you are the same generation, were annoyed by the fact that we could get drafted to go fight a war that we had no political say over. We could get drafted at 18, but we couldn't vote until 21. And so people said, this is not right. We have to make the two ages the same. Otherwise, it denies the principle of equality, the principle of democracy. And of course, what those people wanted was, let's raise the draft age to 21. That's not what we got. Lowered the voting age to 18 and kept the draft age at 18. Anyway, so democracy emerged in the United States in the 19th century. And we have had this system really since about 1900, beginning of the 20th century, where capitalism and democracy have essentially been consensus choices of Americans as to how to organize our economy and how to organize our political system. But it's worth noting historically that they weren't there at the beginning. They emerged over time. They evolved over time. And there's no guarantee that they are the end of political development and evolution in the United States. I've explained to you how America's economy was more capitalist in 1900 than today, because that, what I've been calling the socialist sector, hadn't emerged. So what this means is that capitalism has been eroded by the growth of the public sector. Will this continue? Will it continue to the point where the public sector becomes larger than the private sector? And by the way, it's usually larger in terms of contribution to GDP. So what are the incomes of people who work in the public sector? What are the incomes of people who work in the private sector? You can measure that. And if it becomes the case, if recent trends, trends of the last century continue, and more of the economy is in the public sector than in the private sector, will capitalism still be the way we should accurately characterize the economy of the United States? I don't see any particular force that is going to maybe slow down but not reverse the growth of the public sector, because the growth of the public sector is the result of these demands of people for things like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and Obamacare and federal student loans and all the other stuff we get used to. And once you get used to them, you don't give them up. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility that the American capitalist economy is going to continue to evolve in a way that makes the U.S. economy 50 years from now, 100 years from now, look very much more like the economies of Europe, which I've said are already farther in that direction. And that needn't be particularly alarming, because it doesn't really challenge the basic principle of how Americans look at themselves and their country. But the second question about the second institution, democracy, this is one. This is one that really does alarm people, because America was essentially the first sizable democracy in the modern world. America invented democracy. And I'll give you some statistics that'll show you about the growth of democracy. In 1800, there were essentially 0 democracies in the world of any size. You can go back to ancient Athens, but that's just a city, that's not a country. In 1800, there were no democratic countries in the world. By 1900, the United States was there, and several European countries were sort of democratic if you could ignore their foreign imperialist enterprises. So Britain at home was democratic, but British India was anything from besides democratic. But leave that aside. So 0 to, let's say, a dozen in 1900. By 2000, there were about 100 to 110 democracies, depending on exactly how you define them and how you count them. But clearly, democracy seemed the wave of the future. And so it seemed a matter of time before everybody was democratic in the world had been taken over by democracy. And if you'd made a prediction in 2000, you just said, yeah, that's the future. But then there has been this backsliding. And so Russia, which had appeared on the verge of becoming democratic, China, which seemed to be becoming more liberal and then maybe more democratic, they've gone backwards. India, which prided itself as the largest democracy in the world, has shown some reversion to authoritarian form. And even the United States, which invented democracy, finds itself in a position, and you can have your own views of President Trump, but I will point this out. If there is one sort of sine qua non, necessary condition for democracy, it is the idea that you hold elections, you count the votes, and you abide by the results of the votes. This is what distinguishes democracy from every other form of government. Because in democracy, we settle our disputes at the ballot box. And we count the votes, and then if our side wins, we say, great. If our side loses, we say, well, congratulations to the winner. We go back home and we work hard so that next time we will. And we don't say, no, I'm not accepting the results of that election. Now, when Donald Trump took that position in 2000, it was a jolt to the American system. When his followers assaulted the Capitol on January 6th of 2021, then it seemed, uh-oh, this is even worse than we thought. But that went away. Donald Trump did, in fact, leave the White House on time on January 20th of that year, but he continued to say, I didn't lose. The election was rigged, it was stolen, I didn't lose the election. And it's one thing if a sore loser says that. Okay, that's Donald Trump. But when his party said, you know what? We're going to take that position too. It took a while for the Republicans all to come around, but they did. So by the time Donald Trump was nominated by the Republicans last summer, the Republican Party was on record as saying, if you think what this means, it was saying, we value our guy over democracy. Okay? Now, it was, to a lot of people, alarming enough that a political party would do this. But here's the scary part, if you want to be scared. And that is, that became the position not simply of the Republican Party, that became the position of the United States when Donald Trump won election on that platform. Now, obviously there are other parts of the platform, but Americans said we would rather have Trump than have democracy. You might think I'm maybe being too harsh on Trump or splitting hairs, but if you think about it, that's what it means. Because before this, before Trump, no presidential candidate could have gotten away with such a thing. And people would say, no, democracy is more important than any particular candidate. So, the United States, by the way, is placed on the list of democratic backsliders among institutions and people who make scorecards of how democratic things are. So, 100 years from now, will the United States be a democracy? 5 years from now, will the United States be a democracy? This is one of the things that's kind of a challenge for us. We don't know. I mean, if we're just predicting, I don't know. But it's not like, I don't know what the weather's going to be, next week. I have no control over the weather next week. But I have a little bit of control. You have a little bit of control over whether the United States is going to be a democracy 5 years from now or 50 years from now. I'm going to leave you, because I actually meant to leave some time for questions, but I'll wait for questions if you want to ask them. I teach undergraduates at the University of Texas. At the beginning of the fall semester, we start out, this is a 2-semester course in American history, and I begin by saying, okay, this is where we were in 1776. And we go from there in the first semester up to the Civil War. And in the Civil War we go from, in the second semester we go from the Civil War to the present. So we've gone through this whole period that I just described to you in 2 semesters. I tell my students at the beginning, I ask them, how many of you think, I'll ask you right now, raise your hand if you think that everything is absolutely perfect about American politics and American political life. That if you were czar of American politics, you wouldn't find a thing to change. Raise your hand if that's what you think. I haven't had anybody raising it. Either audience like this nor my students. So I say, that tells me that you think there's at least one thing wrong, one thing that could be made better. Now, I tell my students, I'm telling you, I'm going to make a statement here that applies to you because you live in a democracy. You have an opportunity to fix those things you don't like. Now, I tell my students who are younger than you, on average. My students are 18 years old. We'll round it up to 20, okay? They're 20 years old. And I say that if you don't like things about American life, American politics at the age of 20, it's not your fault. You did not create this world that you are about to inherit as adults, okay? Blame me. Blame people of my age and my generation. We created this world we're handing off to you. That's what I tell them at the beginning in the fall, when we're talking about 1776. When we get up to the present, in the spring, we'll get there in 6 weeks or so, at the end of the semester, I say, okay, here we are at the present. Now, I'm about to send you, dear students, off into the world. Believe it or not, most of you, statistically, are going to be alive 50 years from now. You will be alive, again, it's a stretch, but it's going to be true. You will be alive when you are as old as I am. And then if you don't like what you see in the world around you, then look in the mirror and blame yourself. Because you have the privilege of living in a democracy where citizens can change the things they don't like. And if the things you don't like when you're 70, it's your fault. So I say to your students, go out in the world, make it better. And this is why, when I close, as I'm closing now, I'm not going to say this is what the world is going to look like 50 years from now, or 250 years from now, because the world is not beyond our control. It's not beyond the control of our children, especially, of our students. And they can fix the stuff that's wrong with it. They have to have the will. They will have the opportunity. They have to take advantage of that opportunity. One of the reasons I continue to teach is that my students come into my classes believing that the world is their oyster. They can fix the stuff that old fogies like me, and forgive me for saying it like you, have done with the world. And I do not disabuse them of this idea. I do not tell them, you know, this world is a hard place to change. The world will try to persuade them of that soon enough. But the fact that they come in with those bright eyes, those bits of trepidation they have on the first day of class, I arrange it so that my class on the first day of the fall semester is the first college class most of them will ever have attended. And so I see them, and they come in and they give me hope that the bad stuff's not cooked into the results, that things can get better. So I'm not going to leave you with a gloomy forecast, because I take away from my students that there's always this chance to improve. Again, it's because we live in a democracy where people get to make decisions. I tell them, if If this were in China, I wouldn't be telling you this. Ordinary people in China have no control, really, over their fate much. But Americans do, so students, it's on you, go get them. Thank you very much. Time for questions?
It's not working.
Okay. Anybody have questions, responses, objections? Yes.
Is that mic working?
There's somebody right here. I'll repeat the question
Yeah,
so everyone
okay.
can hear.
I was just going to say, so I was lucky enough to take both of those 315L and K classes 10 years ago.
Hey!
Yeah.
Were you in my class?
I was.
Ah, wonderful. You came tonight. Thank you.
Believe it or not, that's the reason I came.
I'm going to take that as a vote of confidence. Thank you very much.
But,
Welcome.
yes. So one of the questions I had was more so on your lecture style. So during those classes, you kind of focus on like one vignette from politics, history, whatever it might be. I think my spring semester was on FDR's life and
There you go.
his relationship.
Hey, I just gave that lecture just the other day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering why you do that versus kind of, getting into the nitty gritty for everything else.
Okay, I will be so blunt as to describe the lecture in a little bit more detail. It focuses on the sex lives of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Who was cheating on whom, when, and what consequences did it have? And one of the reasons I do it is that I have been teaching in a classroom since 1977. So I'm approaching 50 years of doing this. And the longer I do this, the more I conclude that especially in a field like history, which is something anybody can teach himself. Just read a book, okay? Especially in a field like history, there's really no such thing as teaching. There is only inspiring the interest of students to teach themselves. So in your case, I'm going to say in your case it worked because my philosophy is that I level with my students. I say, I am not going to try to fill you with information in this course. 50 years ago, I would have. But now, information is as readily available as wherever your phone happens to be. Do you need to know what the terms of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1841 are? Just look it up. There it's on your phone. So, that's taken as a given. But I also learned back then that I could fill my students up, and you were best student in the class, if I remember. Are your parents here? Okay. I could fill my students up with information, but if I did not engage their interest, they would start forgetting what they had learned as soon as they walked out of the final exam. If, on the other hand, I could convince them there's something interesting in history, there are good stories there that you could find yourself, then I will have succeeded. Maybe not in that moment. I will be the first student that, having been in this business for a long time, that 19, 20-year-old young people are not intrinsically drawn to history. Nor should they be. Their lives are ahead of them. And if your life is ahead of them, you're not inclined to look backwards. But as we get older, when we reach that point where we realize that more of our life has already been lived than is yet to be lived, then we develop an interest in our own history, which readily extrapolates into other people's history. So, I'm aiming for you 10 years out of college, 20 years out of college, 30 years out of college. And so, at some point, when you hear, hey, there's this history lecture, this is going to take place, this museum in Anchorage, maybe I'll go. And maybe 15 years later, 20 years later, you think, okay, I once heard this interesting story about Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. I will tell you, what's your name?
Ryan.
As Ryan demonstrates, this is one they remember. Okay? There is this natural interest in this sort of thing. But what I try to do is I try to hook them at 19, 20. Most of them don't become history majors. But they potentially become their own sort of history minors. It might happen 40 years later. I've been fortunate enough in my teaching career to win certain teaching awards, but the one that has meant the most to me is one that's given by the Alumni Association at UT, where it polls students 10, 15, 20 years after they leave and asks them, so what professor did you have at UT that had the most lasting impression on you? And I was fortunate enough, and I was really honored to get this award. I thought, okay, it's working. And Ryan, you came tonight, so you're another example. Thank you very much. Next
I
question.
have a question in the back.
Okay, yes, in the back.
I do, thank you. First, just thank you. You're taking me back to my college days when somebody gave a marvelous lecture, and it is a true pleasure to listen to you. So thanks a lot. I remember being told history is the ground we walk on, and if we do not know it, we are lost. And listening to you, I think about that. So I've just come from a Democratic protest where people are trying to speak to representatives or senator and congressperson who will not show up for town halls. And tomorrow night I am hosting a panel called Responding to Threats to American Democracy. And so I'm going to toss you a hard one. I'm sure you can imagine what might be coming, but the panel will have a history professor from the university, a political science professor from the university, a couple of other folks, the head of the ACLU and so on. But when we think about that, at least I do, I've long said to people, we only have a certain number of levers we can pull in a democracy. We can vote, we can protest, we can strike, we can boycott, we can do civil disobedience, we can talk, or we can use violence. Those seem to be the things available to us. But you mentioned January 6th. In the last week, I think we all know that I think for the first time in the history of this country, the president has openly defied the courts, right? Openly defied the rule of law, literally, and other members of the party have said, we don't care what the judges say, we're gonna do this anyway, right? So clearly, the usual levers, that's why everybody's feeling so weird, right? You see anything else? I mean, this is what we're tossing to the panel, and I don't expect them to answer. I don't expect you to answer, but I'm curious.
I'm going to give an answer, and it might not be what you want to hear. And I say this because when I have suggested this to various people that I know who I think share the political views you expressed, they don't want to hear it either. And it is this. So what can a citizen do in a case like this? And yeah, you can protest, you can do all the stuff that you just identified. I'm going to suggest something else. That you can find somebody you know that you disagree with profoundly in politics. And you stop and ask yourself, why does that person think the way that person thinks? And remember that in a democracy, being right is no guarantee that you're going to get your way. You got to get the votes. And in a democracy, everybody has an inherent constitutional moral right to his or her own opinion, as wrong as it might be. And it is tempting for people to say, boy, if this country elects Donald Trump, then it must be going crazy. And that the people who voted for Donald Trump are ignoramuses, or they've been deluded, but they're not worth engaging with. You might feel that, but that is a very counterproductive way of proceeding. For Democrats, the opposition party, to say that the reason we lost this last election is that voters were simply too stupid to vote the right way is as unproductive as for the proprietor of a failing business to say, the reason this business is failing is that shoppers are too stupid to come shop here. Well, you might think that, but it's not going to save your business. Your job is to change their minds. Your job, if you don't like the people who got elected, is to change the minds of those voters. And you do not change, I'm not criticizing you, I don't know, you're probably a very nice person, so this is nothing personally reflected, but nobody's mind was ever changed by being yelled at. Nobody's mind was ever changed by being scorned, by being considered, what was the term that Hillary Clinton used? The deplorables, yes. When you say that all you do is you cause people to dig their feet in further. Now, you might believe that they're stupid and that they're deplorable. And if you prefer the feeling, again, I'm not speaking to anybody in particular in this room, but if you, because I have a lot of friends who exhibit this feeling, they seem to value more their feeling of righteous indignation. I'm better than those people who voted for Donald Trump. Well, if you take that attitude, we're going to get Donald Trump and Donald Trump and Donald Trump or whoever comes next. Because minds are not changed unless you are willing to say, tell me why you voted the way you did. And we can have a conversation. Because Trump voters are just as sincere as people who voted for Kamala Harris. They believe that they are just as devoted to the country that we live in. They don't say, oh boy, we're going to screw those Democrats because we hate the Democrats. No, we think that, given our choices, Donald Trump is better. He has his faults, but he's better than Kamala Harris. So if you want to make change, ask why. Or, to put it even more harshly toward the Democrats, what have the Democrats done to make their brand so obnoxious that people will choose Donald Trump over a Democratic nominee? And that should sober Democrats up, because Donald Trump carries more baggage than any candidate in history, for 50 years. And he's gotten elected twice. So the Democrats have done something to alienate voters. And change is only going to come if you win those people back. And the way you win them back in a democracy is to persuade them. Now, of course, there are challenges to this. If we lose the right of free speech, as I suggested, and this is not an idle prospect. I said earlier that Americans had a choice between Donald Trump and democracy in 2024. And what did they choose? Donald Trump. Not by much. By 1.5 percentage points in the popular vote. So it wasn't a landslide, it wasn't a mandate, but nonetheless he won. That's the way the rules, that's the way the game is played. So what that does mean, the hopeful side of this is, you don't have to change many minds to make an effect. So that's the advice I would give. Nothing is cooked in. Nothing's inevitable until it happens. Time for one more?
We have one more question.
I'm really intrigued by the notion that we chose democracy and we chose capitalism and that you're dividing the two. And I wonder how, because in my amateur assessment of now and political history, is that because of capitalism, we have more calls for democratic equality as far as rich and poor and how that works. But I'm curious what your take is on, everybody says, democracy is at risk, but is it because of capitalists in that larger sense of we have Musk and we have...
So this is a very good question. And actually I devoted a book to this very question.
I'm reading it.
American Philosophy. Very good. Maybe I shouldn't spoil the end. But basically, there is an inherent tension between capitalism and democracy. Now this despite the fact that on the 4th of July, lots of patriotic speakers praise both of them as just flip sides of the same coin of personal freedom. But the basic tension is this, that democracy is premised on the idea of equality. I get one vote, you get one vote, you get one vote, you get one vote. You can be as rich as John Rockefeller and you don't get any more votes than the poor folks who work for John Rockefeller. And that's the foundation principle of democracy. Capitalism has a very different dynamic. Capitalism is based on the principle of inequality. The reason that John Rockefeller has so much more money than people who work for him is that people are willing to buy to pay John Rockefeller for the services he provides by putting kerosene in all of their lamps. And this is the reason that a star football quarterback can make $50 million a year. And somebody who teaches your kids in second grade might be lucky to make $70,000 a year. There's no sort of moral calculus that says this makes sense. It's just the way the economy that we have chosen works. And the reason it works this way is to select for the people who have particular talents to do what we want them to do. The reason that LeBron James makes so much money is that a lot of people want to watch him play basketball. And they will pay for it. And so our economy, our capitalist economy is set up to make sure that's what he does. And he doesn't go off and teach second grade, because that would be a waste of his peculiar talents. And so not only is inequality the engine of a capitalist economy, it's also an output of the capitalist economy. And so people bring unequal talents to the economic square. And I'm better at running a business than you are. And you're better at doing something else. And so you choose to do that, and I choose to do this. We're not the same. We don't have equal talents. And some people are more talented, they get paid more. And the capitalist economy magnifies those inequalities because it rewards people who have these rare talents even more. And they get richer. And if left to itself, capitalism does make the rich richer. It doesn't necessarily make the poor poorer, except comparatively. So during the Gilded Age, when the United States embraced capitalism, the rich got richer and the poor got richer too. Now, they didn't get rich as fast as the rich got richer. And when people measure economic well-being, sometimes it's an absolute scale. Oftentimes it's comparative. An experiment that I do with my students is I say, would you rather be John D. Rockefeller in 1900 or John Q. Public in 2000? That is, would you like to be the wealthiest man in the United States in 1900 or just an average person in the United States in 2000? And I point out that if you were an average person in the United States in 2000, your material standard of living would have been better than John Rockefeller's in 1900 because of all the improvements in society, the availability of medicines. You could have not a cell phone yet, but you could have it's not a smartphone, you could have a phone, you could travel, you could do all these things that John Rockefeller could not do. But a lot of people are more responsive to this idea of fairness and inequality than they are to the absolute standard of living. Which is why I said when I was talking about capitalism, if you want to maximize the total output of the system, go capitalist. And put as few regulations and restrictions on capitalism as possible. Just let capitalism be what capitalism is going to be. Now, if in the process you do not like the outcome, the unequal outcomes, then you can make changes, probably in the political side of things, not necessarily in the economic side of things. You can redistribute wealth and income. And that's what we do with taxes and what we do with Social Security and Medicare and all that stuff. So, yes, there is this inherent tension in the relationship between capitalism and democracy. And it's heightened by the fact that the democratic side of the system, the democracy side of the system, makes the rules that either allow or prohibit capitalism from doing what the capitalists want to do. And the capitalists, as capitalists, they always chafe under this. And so whenever the Republicans get elected, they're more the capitalist party. Let's reduce the regulations. Let's lower taxes. Let's, let capitalists be capitalists. But the Democrats are less sympathetic to that, and they're more inclined to emphasize democracy and equality over capitalism and inequality. And so you get this back and forth. And until now, the back and forth has been manageable. The one problem that people have been concerned about, and this has come up ever since the most powerful person politically in the United States has as its right hand the wealthiest man in the world. So when you get this alliance of the unequal economics with the power of the presidency focused at the top of democracy, well, I don't know what's going to happen because there's never been anything like this in American history. The rich have tried to influence the rich. The capitalist successful, the capitalist moguls, have tried to influence democratic politics for a long time. But until now, they have done it quietly, discreetly. There has never been the case. John D. Rockefeller never took a job as the hitman for the President of the United States. And J.P. Morgan never did. And when they did try to influence politics again, they kept in the background because they understood that Americans revered this political system that emphasized democracy. And they would really take it amiss if they stepped too forward into that. Apparently, times change and values change. And what was unacceptable 100 years ago has become acceptable. Of course, you know, how long this bromance between Trump and Musk lasts is an open question. We're not only dealing with the most powerful person in the world and the richest person in the world, we're dealing with probably the largest egos in the world. And it's unclear which is bigger and how this is going to turn out. But anyway, yeah, this is a justifiable source of concern. And as I say, and from the late 19th century until now, capitalism and democracy have been able to coexist, often uncomfortably. The capitalists worry about that growing what I call the socialist sector. Okay, but they've lived with it. Now, will they continue to do so? We'll see. Anyway, thank you all. You've been a wonderful audience.
And you know, it's in the past we haven't had this set up, so I was like, oh, it worked. Thank you so much. I gotta take a picture of your setup. This is fantastic. Yeah, but how long have you guys been doing this? I mean,
They started doing it during
COVID?
COVID, I
Yeah.
want to say, but the person who was doing it got a new job, so
So now you've just been trying to learn it?
been
Fantastic.
like learning it and
Wonderful.
so yeah, no, it's great. I mean, it's